Hello and welcome to Exchanges for another week. How would you go about having a lunch with a stranger? Would you have the ability to actually instigate that interaction and then also follow through with it? Not only that, what biases and behaviors you put in place to put that as a barrier, not just to what a lunch would bring, but what it might actually mean to getting a sale or to actually creating a network that could then lead to a services business that could continue to expand, to actually therefore also allow social interaction to be the driving force of not just your business, but also the markets and economics that we live in. Because in the world of AI, social interaction is still the number one thing that will get things done. My next guest is an incredible author who has just written a book, 500 Lunches. It is Nick Bendel, and he spent the last 6.5 months interviewing 500 different people about what they do and how they do it. Not just that, it also taught him about how he can drive better relationships, better drive in his business, and better drive in actually how he understands the world. Before we get into Nick's interview, don't forget we are now sponsored by MyTrade, a CFD provider based right here in Melbourne, offering over 900 markets across all different kinds of categories. Please have a look at the T's and C's and also the AFSL on their website. That's MyTrade Global to have a look now. But now let's get into Nick and this week's Exchanges. Nick Bendel, welcome to Exchanges. What a journey. 6 years it has taken, is it not, to do 500 individual lunches. First and foremost, got to ask, what actually inspired that concept and that period of time to do something so incredibly interesting in this part of the cycle?
Well, that is a key question, Evan. I had lunch with 500 strangers from August 2019 to August 2025. And the reason I did it, not long before starting the lunches, I had started a business. And I was desperate for the business to succeed because I saw the business as my future. But I was also quite uncertain and had quite a bit of anxiety connected to the business because I'd never had a business before and I didn't know what I needed to do to succeed with business. And over the course of thinking constantly about it over a few months, I came to a realization, which was if I stayed as the person I was at the time, and the person I was at the time was someone who liked to be at home on his own with a cup of tea and a good book, didn't like to socialize, didn't like to put himself out there, I thought that sort of person would struggle to build a successful business, would struggle to meet people, struggle to build relationships, struggle to make sales. And it occurred to me that I had to get some different behaviors and adopt a different mindset and grow a powerful network. And as those thoughts were forming in my mind, I came across a woman in Melbourne named Kaylee Chu, who, funnily enough, had lunch with 100 strangers and then published a book about it. And I discovered this new book and I bought a copy of the book and I thought, well, that's a great idea. I'm going to steal her idea because she describes in the book this incredible growth journey that she went on through having all these lunches. Initially, I was going to have 100 just like her, but then at some point in the book, Evan, she explained that her goal was 100, but having gotten to 100, she was continuing to meet people because the lunches were so beneficial. And I thought, well, wait a sec, if I'm going to get to 100 and keep going, why call it lunch with 100 strangers? Why not call it lunch with 500 strangers? And so that's why I decided to do these lunches with strangers and why I picked the number 500. That woman, Kaylee Chu, she was actually the very first person I had lunch with. She was wonderful. And I then had another 499 and met some incredible people along the way.
So I want to go right back because there's huge amounts of information in what you've just said, which I think is absolutely fascinating. First and foremost then, going back to yourself, sounds like you would describe yourself slightly introverted. Would that be a fair assessment?
Definitely fair. And I'm still an introvert. It's just that I no longer let that hold me back. I used to be an introvert who was very uncomfortable in social settings. Now I'm an introvert who's comfortable in social settings and has much better social skills.
So that was going to be my next question then. Obviously, as you said, being that kind of personality, at least, you were able to self-identify with that, and then starting that business, understanding clearly the business was a sales sort of business and therefore requiring relationship to relationship interaction. What behavioral mechanisms did you actually find that you had to change pretty quickly? And when you actually started interviewing people, how fast did you find that actually your own personality was good for having a one-on-one meeting? Because clearly what I would argue, working in behavioral economics and behavioral finance, is that introverts actually are really, really good at listening. And so I assume that's what you found would have happened talking to, CEOs, et cetera, particularly, who tend to be quite extroverted. They want to tell you everything. So you would have heard a lot of information. Did that all help with the whole process?
So to answer your last question first, yes. I discovered, as you mentioned, that being an introvert actually, I think, gives you an advantage when it comes to meeting people and talking to strangers and going to networking events, because I much prefer to listen than talk, and I much prefer to give the other person a chance to talk. And I'm really curious to ask questions and genuinely listen to the answers. And I found that's a great way to build rapport with people and make them feel comfortable. I should mention, even though I was having these lunches because I thought it would help me with my business, I didn't try to turn any of the people I met into clients. And many of the people I met were people who could never be clients. But I just had this sense that if I'm meeting all these people, if I'm learning these valuable interpersonal skills, if I'm building a great network, if I'm strengthening my mindset, that will indirectly help with my business, and it will indirectly lead to other opportunities down the line as well.
So the question is, has it? Because I assume you've still got your business. The relationship, the argument always in our world is 1 out of 10 is actually an incredible hit rate. So if you've got a 10% conversion rate, that's there. You've interviewed 500 people. You're talking about, 50 people here in terms of possible relationships that have actually turned into something else. Is that a fair and reasonable thing that you've seen from this experience?
Of the people I had lunch with, I think maybe a dozen or so have become clients. That was them asking me rather than the other way around. But I never looked at it as I need to get business from the lunches, because that was never the point. I looked at it as I need to experience personal growth, which I have. Mm-hmm. And if I do that, that will somehow lead to something down the line. And it's definitely led to all sorts of business, all sorts of benefits. I've just focusing purely on that business that I mentioned, I've got some clients. One of the people I had lunch with became a business partner and a good friend. I was given opportunities to speak at events. Sometimes I'll cold call a potential client and I'll have no idea who that person is. And they'll say something like, "Oh, you're that guy who's been having all those lunches." And they already feel like they know me, which then makes the sales process much easier because they feel like there's already some trust there. So it certainly benefited from a business perspective, but I think it would be a mistake to look at it through such a narrow lens, because what it's done is it's just opened my mind in so many ways. I used to think I was open-minded, but I didn't realize until I started having these lunches just how closed-minded I was. And just the process of meeting so many different people and so many different types of people and being exposed to all these different ideas and personalities and ways of thinking, it makes you realize, Evan, just how close-minded you are. And so that's been a really valuable process. And just through becoming more open-minded and meeting more people, I've tried new experiences. I've changed in really positive ways, and my life has evolved in ways that never would have happened had I not gone through that process.
So that sounds like what you're talking about is that the closed-mindedness I normally refer to as obviously your internal biases that just allow you to navigate your everyday life. And therefore, because they're there, you sort of do see that as the setting. Therefore, my question for you straight out, there clearly is several interviews or multiple of those lunches that have really stuck out. Which one really opened your mind then? Which one really sort of said to you, okay, hang on a minute, some of my processes, my thought processes, my internal biases, etc., have meant I've been, completely blinkered to this concept. Who were they and what did they tell you that led to that change?
Okay. Well, I'll give you an example that's going to sound maybe a little odd, which is for basically my whole life, I just have not been into eating vegetables. I just didn't like eating vegetables, and never used to bother me. And in fact, I didn't realize that it actually became a part of my identity. I was the guy who didn't do vegetables. And the ninth person I had lunch with, Paul, who ended up becoming a good friend, he is, amongst other things, a nutritionist. And I remember we were catching up a few months after we first met, and he started telling me about this vegetable shake that he has every day. And he convinced me to try it. And to my astonishment, I liked the taste. So I started having one of these every day, and I continued to do so. And that started exposing me to vegetables. And then through that process, that that changed the way I thought about vegetables. This is probably going to sound odd to most people
No, go for it.
who just eat vegetables. But I didn't realize this. I'd kind of seen vegetables as the enemy, and I didn't realize that my identity was the guy who didn't eat vegetables. But by having vegetables every day, I started changing my thinking, and then I went and saw a hypnotherapist who cured me of my aversion to vegetables. And ever since then, I now love vegetables, and I eat vegetables constantly. And that is probably going to sound odd to some people who just eat vegetables naturally. But for me, this was a really big step. I had to change more than 40 years of programming, and I had to completely change my identity. And that made me so much more open-minded, and I think changed my life in a really positive way, because eating vegetables is definitely a much healthier path to take than not eating vegetables.
Yes, I'd have to agree. Well, so that's what I find fascinating about this whole situation, is that it's not just about, bettering yourself for your own, personal income gain. It's about changing yourself with regards to your own personal, behaviors that have clearly been there for a long, long time. I think the other one I see in the book that was quite fascinating is the flip side, is that because of your personality and because of how your biases work, the rub off it had is that it made you very open. So some of the stories that I read in there was that people were opening up to you about some very personal things very quickly. What is it about? Is it the setting? Is it the way that you spoke to them? Is it the fact that that's what they'd been looking for that allowed people to really open up and give you a relationship that, to you as a complete stranger, that they probably wouldn't do normally?
I think that's a really insightful question. And I would say there were a few reasons. Part of it was the people who were accepting my lunch invitations tended to be much more open than the average person. Probably 95% of the people I contacted never replied to my invitation, which was fine. But what I noticed is that the people who were willing to say yes to lunch with a stranger were by nature just a lot more open-minded and positive than the average person. I think that was part of it. I think another part of it was I was inviting people to lunch, not a coffee. A coffee, I think in most people's minds, is a short, superficial encounter, whereas a lunch is a longer, deeper, more meaningful encounter. I think that was part of it. And then also what we discussed before, Evan, I prefer to listen rather than talk. And I'm just naturally curious. And I think that put a lot of people at ease. And because a lot of the people I met were really emotionally open, they were disclosing so many incredibly personal things to me. And it's funny, if we could go back to one of your earlier questions as to how these lunches changed me. Funnily enough, having all these people be so open with me also had a big effect on me, because I didn't realize until then that I was quite an emotionally closed person. And I would get home from these lunches where these people had told me incredibly personal things. And I would think to myself, well, it almost doesn't seem fair, because they're telling me these deep experiences and I haven't really told them anything. And bit by bit, lunch by lunch, I started opening up like a degree at a time. And over the course, by the time I'd had the 500 lunches, I was a lot more open emotionally than I had been. And funnily enough, as I say, that not only made me more open-minded in general, it made me a lot more self-aware, and it made me realize that I had been quite closed emotionally. That in turn led me to go to therapy, which was really, really valuable. And so by the end of the 500 lunches, I became so much more emotionally open than I had been before. And one of the catalysts was having lunch with these wonderful people and them opening up to me.
One of the other things that I want to really drill into for the next little bit is the angle that comes with this is networking, right? So you stated this right at the start that, you needed to actually start to realize that if you were going to succeed at what you wanted to do at that time, which was your business, you needed to networking. And I think you say this a few times, that most networking advice fails smart people. So then what's wrong with conventional advice? How are we networking incorrectly from what you found from those 500 lunches you had?
I think the reason most networking advice fails is because it assumes that the people receiving the advice don't know how to network. And people do know how to network. You just go to an event where there are people, or you contact someone you want to meet. So it's not that people don't know what to do. It's that they hesitate. They hesitate to pick up the phone and contact the potential client or the stranger they want to build a relationship with. They hesitate to attend a networking event where they don't know anyone, or maybe it feels a little, I don't know, sleazy or a little wrong somehow. And I think that's where this networking advice fails. It professes to teach people stuff they already know. And
Mhm.
I think probably the other reason it fails is it, it kind of implies that the reason people aren't talking to strangers or picking up the phone or attending the event is because they're not sufficiently motivated. They do have the motivation and they do have the knowledge. They're just, there's this psychological blockage. So I think better networking advice is not, hey, here's why you should network. People already know. Or even like, here are the benefits of networking. People already know the benefits. It's coming up with a framework that allows them to do something that they feel uncomfortable with.
Can I take that a little bit further? Is it also because networking requires making relationships? Relationships take a level of time that I sometimes think in this day and age we're not willing to make. And then, as you said, the psychological embarrassment, I would argue, is the word of doing that. Does that therefore mean that we need to be thinking about who and how we're networking rather than just, as you said, I would almost say mass networking ideas? This is how you should do it and this is what it is. It's more, if you want the relationship and the network to work, it is choosing better areas and better things that rather than just going down one generic route.
Hmm. Yeah, I do think there's some truth to that, Evan, because we can't, there are only 24 hours in a day and we only have so much time and bandwidth that we can't be networking 24 hours a day. So I think we do need to be selective with the rooms we're in and the people we talk to. So yes, I do think it's important to be selective. I also think it's important to, uh, to, to get rid of expectations that anything's going to happen quickly,
Mm.
because I think if you are trying to rush a relationship, the other person realizes that it's not a real relationship; it's a transaction you're looking for, and also the conversations you'll have they're going to be quite superficial and transactional. So I would suggest, I think a better way of going about it is not trying to get something from each encounter, but maybe trying to come up with a system or a collection of habits that over the long term will allow you to build more relationships and better relationships.
You've sort of then answered what I was going to ask you next, which obviously around what's the most common mistake that you see in the relationship. But the extension of that is in your lunches. Was there any story that really stood out as the biggest mistake somebody had made? Was it, the fact, as you said, they turned it into a transaction, the way that they were going about their networking, or that they, decided just to completely burn certain groups because they didn't see them as advantageous? What was the biggest mistake that you heard in your lunches?
Well, I was maybe lucky in that, as I said, that the people who accepted my invitation were people who were a lot more positive and open-minded and proactive than the average person. And so they, by and large, were a group who were actually really good at networking, by and large. And so they tended to do it better than the average person. But I did encounter some people, and also uh, who kind of took a transactional approach. They showed up to the lunch wanting to sell something to me, or not directly, but telling me their kind of resume and what they're offering, and can I introduce them to this person or that person. So that was something I sometimes saw, or they would tell me themselves that they admired what I was doing, meeting all these people, because they knew that they needed to meet more people, and they weren't getting out there and doing it themselves. So that was maybe the other big mistake I saw. People thinking that they should be connecting with more strangers, they should be doing more networking, but either not having the time, or more commonly just not having, not feeling like they could get over that psychological hurdle.
I think that we need to bring in the next part of the discussion, which is we live in a digital age. You and I are talking to each other through a digital medium. People are listening to this either on a podcast or watching this on YouTube, where AI sits into it. We are moving down more and more the angle of trying to, at least in some cases, replace human contact with digital contact. What have you seen with the research over the last 6.5 years of you doing this book about how digitization is changing the networking and the relationship process that you would love to fix, and what you think could actually be the biggest help to it going forward?
It's funny because one of the recurring themes of my lunches. So my lunches started in 2019, and ChatGPT came along in late
Did exist, yeah.
2022.
Yeah.
And so my lunches kind of started before ChatGPT and other AI tools, and then continued afterwards. So, but even before ChatGPT came along, one of the recurring themes of my lunches was the fact that people are finding it harder to have face-to-face conversations. They're finding it harder to pick up their phone. They're more reliant on text messages and emails and digital tools. And people are becoming increasingly lonely. I heard this from so many people I had lunch with. They were either describing themselves or their friends or their children. And I think since then, with the advent of ChatGPT and Claude and these other AI tools, that's only increased. And I think it's only going to increase further. And I think the ability to have face-to-face conversations and to build real relationships and to do socially difficult things like picking up the phone and calling someone or maybe having a hard conversation. I think those skills have always been important, but I just think they're becoming ever more important with every passing day and week and month. And I think the people who master those human skills are going to become even more valuable than they've been in the past, because anything that can be done by a computer or an AI tool will at some point. But the things that only humans can do or humans can do best, they're the things where I think we're going to look to more and more. And so I think this ability to have conversations, to build relationships, to listen actively, to have empathy for people, to be willing to have difficult conversations. I think those are skills that are going to become increasingly valuable.
Yeah, interesting you say that, because the research is starting to very much back that. So again, despite there is suggestions that, human to robot relationships in transactional material is actually more advantageous and we'd rather prefer it. When it comes to service, we want the other way around. We do actually want it, despite the fact that it's never been easier now to communicate with each other through a digital text messaging, Instagram of these worlds, etc. Social media interaction is getting higher. Is that also the other part of your lunches that you found, is that actually because you had that one-on-one relationship where it was a stranger, but clearly it turned into a network that then turned into, a friendship, a business joint venture as you had with some of your friends now from it, that those businesses that can resist the very easy appeal that will be going down a robot digitization will actually end up succeeding further, because the broader network it creates, the broader human interaction it creates, will actually lead not just to business outcomes, but just better outcomes in general.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought much about that, Evan. And now that you're putting me on the spot, I'm imagining that there are probably some things that we want to be automated, and there are probably some things we want to remain manual and human. I'm going to steal someone else's term. I don't know if you've heard of the term digilog, the idea that we kind of have analog hearts and digital minds. And so I wonder if that isn't going to become even more pronounced in the future. There are some things we want done quickly, which relies on automation, but then there are some things where we still want a human touch. Funnily enough, I know a lot of mortgage brokers, and I know this is something that the mortgage broking industry, amongst others, is grappling with. In the future, are people even going to want to speak to mortgage brokers? I think definitely yes. I think people will increasingly want some parts of the process to be automated, but I also think where large amounts of money are at stake, where you're uncertain, where you want someone to just tell you, there are 40 options, Evan, and I think you should go with option 6. I think having that human touch is going to be really valuable. So I suspect it's going to be a combination of digital and analog in the future that we want.
I'm going to go back to also your book here, because we're sort of staying on the digital line. You clearly used social media to start this all off and the reach out. How did you find that distance from going from the digital reach out to then becoming the physical reach out? What was the sort of the steps there? Because this is the other part of it, is that it is actually useful. It does have clear relationships, and social media does have some good points. How was that? It's almost like a stepped process. Did you go from reaching out through socials to then asking for a physical meeting that led to the relationships that you end up having?
Actually, this is another interesting question because I'd actually never reflected on this until you asked about it. But
Yeah.
so yes, it was actually a combination of the two. The vast majority of people I contacted via LinkedIn. And so that was a social element. There was kind of a bit of trust built into the process because they could immediately look at my profile and see that I was a real person. And I would also send them a link to an article I'd written about what these 500 lunches were and why I was doing it. And then I would ask them if they wanted to meet. And most people, 95% wouldn't reply, but 5% did agree to meet. And then I guess we're going from online to offline. And the first few lunches that I had that felt a bit awkward, but for me, it eventually began to feel normal. But when I was meeting people, it was like my 380-second lunch, but for them, it was their first lunch with a stranger. And so I had to keep reminding myself, even though it was normal for me, it wasn't normal for them. And it could sometimes be a bit uncomfortable for them initially going from online to offline, but they quickly got into it as well.
Then the other follow-on question is, did you feel from those social to offline interactions that there was a bigger bond once the face-to-face relationship happened versus the online? Because again, a lot of the work that you're seeing right now, a lot of the marketing media is that if you can go through socials, if you can almost, I think the word needs to be mass spam. And even though you did 95% didn't get back to you through LinkedIn, you did have that follow-up, you did have the 5%, there's a bigger relationship there, and you still got 500 people, clearly. Where is the break point? Because clearly mass spamming through social has worked for people. It does lead to outcomes. But at what point did you find that actually my medium through social to then go offline was a much better option, to then use even offline as just the one-to-one to get that next lunch? What is the difference now? Because again, I'm trying to get back to the human relationship here, is that we're clearly slightly resistant to it. We clearly like the fact that social acts almost as like that psychological embarrassment barrier you were talking about a couple of answers ago. What would you find and what did you feel was different once you went through the social barrier and into the offline that allowed better outcomes for everything?
When I met someone face-to-face or they met me face-to-face, it just turbocharge the trust process and the relationship process. And you've actually reminded me of an interesting story. This happened about 5 months ago. Every 3 months, I organize a coffee for all the people I've had lunch with. It's always on a Sunday afternoon. I always tell them it's going to be at this cafe at this time in this place. You don't need to RSVP to show up if you want to show up. So I never know who's going to show up. And it's always different people. And they always really like meeting each other because I've met such a diverse group of people and so many impressive people. And so I had this catch up 5 months ago, and the attendees, we kind of split into two groups. I was at one side of the table, and on the other side of the table, there was a different group. And in this group, I didn't realize at the time, they later filled me in. There were 3 single women, Evan, and they'd never met before. And they started talking, and they discovered that they were finding it really hard to do online dating because you would see these profiles and you wouldn't know if these were real people. And then if you contacted them, and you might end up meeting them, so many of them turned out to be liars, they said. Some of them were married, and you just didn't know who to trust. So they came to me and they said, "Oh, Nick, the 3 of us have been talking. We've discovered we're all trying online dating. We're finding it hard because we don't know who to trust. But Nick, we know that we can trust you, and we know you've met all these great men because we're here now and we can see all the people you've met are great. So we reckon, Nick, you should organize an event where you invite the single men you've met and the single women you've met and bring them all together." And they said, "Nick, because we trust you, we know that any man you trust, we can trust." And I said, "Okay." So I actually organized an event at my place for 8 single men and 8 single women. And it was an incredible night. And it came back to this thing you identified a few minutes ago, Evan, which was because these women had met me in real life, they felt they could trust me, and we built a relationship. Exactly. I'm real. And that then meant that they could trust people who I had met in real life and who I trusted. And that wouldn't have been possible if there had never been those face-to-face interactions.
Wow. Okay. That's a brilliant answer. And that is so good to hear that it's still real, right? So again, going back to my world and trying not to do it too much, but the research is still telling us that that's it. The biggest barrier, and you've said it all the way through the last half an hour, it's breaking, first and foremost, I think, the embarrassment of actually to meet a stranger, which we're not getting better at. I don't argue we're getting worse at. But then also showing that once trust is there, the ability to then grow more trust with others is even higher. So I'm going to leave you on that, and I'm going to finish therefore with the question I always ask, because I can't wait to hear your answer to this, which is, Nick Bendel, if you're in charge one day, what would you do?
Okay. Well, one of the big themes of my lunches, Evan, was this concept that I now can't stop thinking about, a concept called social courage. Social courage is doing things before you feel ready, where you feel uncomfortable, where you feel as though you might fail, or you might be embarrassed, or you might be judged or rejected or laughed at. And I've come to realize that, and this was through so many of the people I met who were displaying social courage of their own, or had displayed it in their lives to great effect, or who sometimes lamented not displaying it at key points in their lives and suffering as a result. I've come to realize that the more social courage we display, the more we achieve in life, the happier we are, the more successful we are. But it's not easy. If it was easy, it wouldn't be courage. And so if I was in charge for a day, I think I would mandate that everyone had to do one uncomfortable thing each week. We all have to perform one act of social courage a week. And what we're going to find is that the more we do it, the more we get into the habit of doing these scary things, the more we're going to grow, the happier we're going to be, and the more successful we're all going to be.
I think that's a brilliant way to finish. Nick Bendel, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on Exchanges.
Thank you so much, Evan.
Big thank you to Nick. What a book. What an undertaking to go through 500 lunches with complete strangers, and the insights that it's given is absolutely incredible. I really do recommend you go and have a read of it. It's quite fascinating. Some of the stories that are in there are insane about how open people can be when you ask the right questions, and understand that if you become quite open, people will react to it the same way. The relationship that brings, and therefore the trust that it brings, is absolutely second to none. As always, thank you very much for watching, listening, and everything in between. We love having you on this Exchanges podcast. But if you haven't, please subscribe. We know that only about a third of you have hit the subscribe button of those of you that actually watch and listen. So if you can, hit the subscribe button, give us a like, and even a review if you could. Don't forget, we've also got an email. It's exchanges@evanlucas.com.au. But until next week, thank you as always for joining. I'll speak to you then.